At 1:15 in the morning on the 4th of February, 1963, a radio operator aboard the tanker Marine Sulphur Queen sends a routine message. She is in the Straits of Florida, some 270 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi, bound from Beaumont, Texas to Norfolk, Virginia. The message is ordinary, a position report and a private note passed along to a crewman's family. Nothing in it is alarming. Nothing in it is a warning. That is the last anyone ever hears from her. There is no distress call. There is no mayday, no flare, no lifeboat lowered into the dark. When she fails to arrive, the search that follows finds only fragments, life jackets and a foghorn and a nameboard and an oar scattered across the sea off Key West. 39 men were aboard. None of them came home, and no one ever found the ship. The record of what happened to the Marine Sulphur Queen is, in the strict sense, blank. The record of what she was runs long. That is where the investigation had to begin. It began with the steel she was made of, and with the choices that put 15,000 tons of molten sulfur inside her. To understand the silence, you have to understand the ship. So let us start there. She began the war as something else entirely and under another name. In 1944, the yards of the United States were turning out ships faster than the world had ever seen. Among the most numerous was a class of oil tanker called the T2, the T2SEA-1 to give it its full designation, a standardized war emergency tanker built by the hundreds to carry fuel across the oceans. More than 500 of them came off the ways before the war ended. The type as a whole numbered in the many hundreds. They were long, plain vessels, a little over 500 feet, with the engine and funnel set aft and the bridge amidships. They were built to be built quickly. That was the point of them. The ship that would become the Marine Sulphur Queen was launched in 1944 as the Esso New Haven, a standard T2 tanker carrying oil. For a decade, she did that ordinary work, and she carried, without anyone quite understanding it at the time, a flaw that ran through her whole generation of ships. To build so many hulls so fast, the yards had turned to welding. Older ships were riveted, their steel plates overlapped and pinned together so that a crack, if one started, would run into a seam and stop. A welded hull is different. Its plates are fused into one continuous sheet of steel, and that is stronger and faster to build. But it means that a crack, once begun, has nothing to stop it. It can run the length of a plate, and then into the next, and then across the whole ship. And the steel of that era had a second, quieter problem. In cold water, certain steels turn brittle. They lose the ability to bend and stretch under strain. Instead of yielding, they snap. Engineers now call it the ductile to brittle transition, and in the 1940s it was only beginning to be understood, largely because of what began happening to these ships. The most famous case happened at a fitting-out dock in Portland, Oregon, and it happened in port in calm water, with no storm to blame. On the 16th of January, 1943, the brand-new T2 tanker Schenectady lay quietly alongside the pier. She had just returned from her sea trials. There was no cargo working and no heavy sea. The temperature was near freezing, and that was all. And then, without warning, she broke. A crack tore across her deck, down both sides and nearly through the bottom. The hull failed so completely that her midsection rose out of the water while her bow and stern settled toward the riverbed. The two ends of the ship stood at an angle to each other, held together by a thread of steel. She had sailed into nothing. She had simply been sitting at a dock when her own hull came apart. The Schenectady was not alone. In the space of a few wartime years, several of these emergency-built tankers and cargo ships fractured, some at sea, some, like the Schenectady, at their berths. A number of them broke completely in two. The pattern was alarming enough that the Navy and the shipbuilders convened boards of inquiry, and the study of brittle fracture in welded steel became, in a real sense, a science born from these failures. The lessons were learned. Crack-arresting straps were riveted into hulls, steel chemistry was improved, and the design was reinforced. But the ships already built kept sailing. The steel already poured stayed in service. A T2 tanker launched in 1944 was a T2 tanker still in the 1960s, older now, worked hard, and carrying with it the same brittle inheritance. The Schenectady had cracked open at a quiet dock. The same steel was still at sea. In 1960, the Esso New Haven was bought by a company that intended to use her for something no T2 had been designed to do. They meant to fill her with molten sulfur. To move sulfur in bulk, you heat it until it flows like thick liquid above about 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and you carry it hot, kept molten by heating coils in insulated tanks. The Esso New Haven was rebuilt for this. Her original oil cargo tanks were cut out, and in their place, shipbuilders installed a single long tank, an independent steel container running most of her length to hold the hot sulfur. She was renamed the Marine Sulphur Queen. She could carry roughly 15,000 long tons of it, kept liquid at some 270 degrees. Understand what that conversion did to her. It took an already aging, brittle steel hull and it cut the structure open to insert something the ship was never framed to hold. The rules of the day required a major structural conversion to be approved by the Coast Guard and by the Classification Society that vouched for the hull, on plans reviewed for strength before the work was passed. Aboard this ship, the conversion was carried out under that approval. Even so, naval architects raised concerns about how it affected her strength, about the way the great inner tank was supported, and whether the girder of the ship, the beam strength that keeps a hull from bending in a seaway, had been compromised. There were warnings. The conversion went ahead, and molten sulfur is not an easy cargo. The requirements for carrying it were exacting. The cargo kept molten by its heating coils, the space above it blanketed with an inert gas so the flammable vapor could not ignite. The tanks vented and the temperature watched, because hot sulfur in air can catch fire and burns into sulfur dioxide, a choking, poisonous gas. In her few years of service, the Marine Sulphur Queen had fires, small blazes in her sulfur, put out, reported, and sailed away from. She had cracks found and patched. Those who knew her carried an unease about her that they did not keep entirely to themselves. The men who sailed her were, by testimony given afterward, not blind to what they were riding. In the inquiry that followed her loss, evidence was heard that members of her crew and men who had sailed on her before had spoken of her plainly. According to that testimony, some of them called her a floating bomb. The phrase comes through the record of the investigation from witnesses recalling what was said. It cannot be fixed to any one man with certainty, but it was said, and more than once. A hot, flammable cargo in a converted hull in a class of ship the sea had already proven could break. A merchant sailor with a grievance about his ship's safety had recognized channels for it. He could log a formal complaint, refuse to sail a vessel he believed unseaworthy, or bring the matter to the Coast Guard, whose inspectors could survey a ship and hold her in port. Whatever misgivings her crews voiced among themselves, no complaint reached those channels in time to keep her at the dock. There were 39 of them on her last voyage. They were officers and crew of an American merchant tanker, masters and mates, engineers who tended the heating coils that kept the cargo molten, oilers and firemen below, seamen on deck, and the cooks and stewards who fed the ship. They had families in port cities along the Gulf and the East Coast. They were doing ordinary, difficult work on a ship many of them mistrusted for reasons that turned out to be sound. She sailed from Beaumont, Texas, on the 2nd of February 1963, loaded with her 15,000 tons of hot sulfur, bound around the tip of Florida and up the coast to Norfolk. For 2 days there was nothing unusual. The weather in the Gulf and the Straits was rough but not extraordinary, winds of gale force over a heavy sea, the kind of going a tanker was expected to take. In the small hours of the 4th of February, from somewhere in the Straits of Florida, she sent that last routine radio message. A position, a note for a family, then nothing. She was due at Norfolk on the 7th. She did not arrive. When she could not be raised by radio, the Coast Guard began to search, and the search widened over the days that followed across the Straits and the Florida coast. For a time, there was only open water and no sign of her at all. Then, nearly a fortnight after her last message, the sea began to give back pieces. On the 20th of February, a Navy vessel recovered debris, and over the following days, searchers gathered life jackets, life rings bearing her name, a broken name board, an oar, a shirt, a cone-shaped foghorn, small fragments of a ship that no longer existed. Some of the life jackets and other items showed the marks of sharks. There were no survivors, and there were no bodies recovered. The ship herself was never found. Not the hull, not the wreck, nothing to stand over and say, "Here she lies." She had simply gone somewhere in the deep water off the Florida Straits with all 39 aboard. The United States Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Investigation, and it faced a hard problem. A total loss, no survivors, no wreck, no distress call, almost nothing to work with but the ship's own history and the scattered debris. The board could not determine with certainty how she was lost. Instead, it set out the ways she might have been, and there were 4. First, that her hull had failed, that the aging, converted, brittle steel girder of the ship had simply broken in the heavy sea, as T2 hulls had broken before. Second, that there had been an explosion, that her flammable sulfur cargo and its vapors had ignited. Third, that she had capsized, rolled over, and been lost, perhaps in a sudden shift of her cargo or a failure of stability. And fourth, a steam explosion, that seawater had reached the hot molten sulfur or its heating system and flashed into steam with destructive violence. Any of the 4 could have taken her in the time it takes to fail to send a mayday. The board declined to choose among them. On the evidence it had, it could not. The ship and her entire crew of 39 men, it recorded, are presumed to be lost. But on one point it was not uncertain at all. The investigation concluded that the Marine Sulphur Queen was unsafe and not seaworthy and never should have sailed, that a ship of her age, her construction, and her hazardous conversion, with her known history of fires and cracks, ought not to have been on that voyage. The finding did not say precisely how she died. It said that she had been allowed to sail when she should not have been. The families of the men aboard went to court. Their case became a landmark in American maritime law, a long, closely argued fight over what a shipowner owes to the men who crew an unseaworthy vessel, and whether the loss of a ship that vanishes without a trace can be laid at the owner's door. It helped shape how the law thinks about seaworthiness and responsibility when a ship is lost with everyone who could have told the story. The Marine Sulphur Queen did not vanish without leaving something behind, even if it was not a wreck. The carriage of molten sulfur by sea, a young trade in 1963, came under harder scrutiny after her loss, with closer attention to how such a cargo is contained, heated, vented, and monitored, and to the strength a hull needs to carry it safely. and the T2 tankers, already old, already known to be built of steel from an era the sea had tested and found wanting, moved steadily toward retirement. The war had needed them built fast. The decades since had shown, in ships like the Schenectady at her Portland dock and the Marine Sulphur Queen in her deep water, the price of that speed. One by one they were withdrawn. A ship is not only her cargo and her crew, she is also her steel and her history and the decisions made about her long before she sails, the weld that cannot stop a crack, the conversion pushed through over an engineer's warning, the fire logged and sailed away from. The Marine Sulphur Queen carried all of that with her into the Straits of Florida, and it went down with her. How she died is not known. What she was and who she carried is. 39 men sailed from Beaumont on the 2nd of February, 1963, aboard a converted tanker built in wartime to be built quickly, men who tended her hot cargo and stood her watches and trusted, as sailors must, that the ship beneath them would hold. She did not. Somewhere in the deep water off Key West, she came apart or burned or rolled over in the little time it takes for a ship to be lost, and the sea gave back only fragments and, among them, a single life ring with her name upon it. The ship was never found. The men were never brought home. What remains is the record. The 4 scenarios that were never narrowed to one, the finding that she should not have sailed, and the names of 39 people who went to sea and did not return. They were a crew of 39.